When you stop being available to everyone, everything changes. Carl Jung observed that the face we show the world is never meant to be mistaken for the face we actually have, and that the moment we forget the difference, something in us quietly begins to suffocate. Nietzsche wrote in The Gay Science, "You shall become the person you are," and he did not mean this as comfort, he meant it as a demand, because most people spend their days becoming the person everyone else needs them to be, the reliable one, the cheerful one, the one who always answers, always shows up, always has room for one more request, and somewhere underneath that endless availability, a person waits, unmet, unlived, wondering when their turn will come. Jung spent much of his working life studying exactly this gap, the space between the mask we wear for others and the self we quietly abandon, in order to keep wearing it well. So let us say something together, plainly, in the first person. I say, I notice where I have made myself available to everyone but myself. I say, I am willing to see the mask I have mistaken for my face. I say, I make the unconscious conscious. Say it with me. I notice where I have made myself available to everyone but myself. I am willing to see the mask I have mistaken for my face. I make the unconscious conscious. And again, slowly, I notice where I have made myself available to everyone but myself. I am willing to see the mask I have mistaken for my face. I make the unconscious conscious. If you would like tomorrow's teaching to find you as gently as this one did, consider subscribing now, so the next fire we sit by is one you don't miss. And while you are here, type the 2 words "face it" in the comments. Just those 2 words, as a small private signal to yourself that you are ready to look. The first key is this. The mask was never the enemy. Jung called this mask the persona, borrowing the word from the masks worn by actors in the ancient theater, and he defined it with a precision that still stings a little when you hear it fully. He wrote that the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is. Read that twice if you need to, because it is doing quiet, exact work. The persona is not a lie exactly. It is a negotiated agreement between you and the world about which parts of you get to be visible in which rooms. The version of you that shows up at work is not fraudulent. It is functional. The version of you that shows up at your mother's table is not fake. It is filial. Every human society runs on this kind of shorthand. We could not function without it. Imagine trying to greet every stranger with the full, unfiltered weather of your inner life. Imagine your surgeon walking into the operating room, narrating her anxieties, instead of performing her role. Imagine, closer to home, a woman standing in her own kitchen doorway each evening, and before she steps through it, she quietly sets down the tone of her day, the sharp email, the argument in traffic, and picks up instead the warmer, steadier voice her children expect to hear. That is not deception. That is a kind of care, a small civilizing act repeated 1,000 times. The mask, in this sense, is a mercy. It lets the machinery of shared life run smoothly. It lets a grieving man still greet his neighbor politely. It lets a tired teacher still walk into the classroom composed. So when we talk tonight about stopping being available to everyone, we are not talking about tearing off every mask and running naked into the street. That is not maturity. That is chaos. We are talking about something quieter and much harder. Noticing when the mask has stopped being a garment you put on and has become the only thing left in the closet. The second key is this. Identification with the mask is the actual disease, not the mask itself. Jung had a phrase for what happens when a person forgets there is a difference between the role and the self performing it. He simply called it identification, and the classic case he returned to again and again was the professor. A man spends 30 years being addressed by his title, his opinions are quoted, his office hours are sacred, his name on the door means something, and slowly, without any single dramatic moment, the professor becomes the textbook. The man disappears into the function. He cannot have a conversation anymore without lecturing. He cannot be corrected without feeling erased. because there is no longer a self standing behind the title to absorb the correction. The title is all there is. Jung watched this happen not only in academia but in every profession that hands a person continuous, flattering, exhausting availability. The pastor who can no longer be anything but pastoral, even at his own son's funeral. The mother who has been needed so constantly for so long that she panics in a quiet house, not because she misses her children, but because she no longer knows who answers when nobody is calling her name. Jung himself understood this splitting from the inside. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he described discovering, as a boy, that he seemed to carry two personalities. One he called number one, the ordinary schoolboy of his time and place, dutiful, social, legible to everyone around him, and one he called number two, older, stranger, connected to centuries, largely silent, almost never invited to the table. He wrote of this second personality with a kind of reverence. And what strikes me every time I return to this passage is that Jung did not resolve the split by choosing one and discarding the other. He learned, slowly, to let both live. Number one handled the world. Number two kept him honest about what the world was not. This is the whole quiet architecture behind tonight's title. When you make yourself endlessly available to everyone, you are, in effect, feeding number one around the clock and starving number two to death. And number two, whatever you want to call it in your own life, the part that reads slowly, that needs unscheduled hours, that has opinions nobody asked for, that part does not send a memo when it starves. It simply goes quiet, and one day you notice you cannot hear it at all anymore. And the third key is this. The bill for universal availability always comes due, and it tends to arrive exactly when you can least afford it, Jung wrote. In a passage that has aged rather uncomfortably well, that a strong identification with a persona allows a man to function in society without punishment, at least for a while. He called it an artificial personality that can operate without consequence. But he was careful to add that the consequence is only postponed, not cancelled. And I want to sit with that word postponed for a moment, because it is doing more work than it first appears. We tend to imagine consequences as immediate, a debt collector at the door. But the psyche keeps a slower ledger than that. It can let you run at a deficit for years, even decades. And the interest simply accrues quietly in a room you have stopped visiting. Imagine, in the spirit of a case Jung might have quietly recognized, a man who spent 40 years as the indispensable one, the reachable one, the calm, competent center everyone called first. At work he was the fixer, at home he was the provider, who never said the burden was heavy. Among friends he was the reliable one who organized the reunion nobody else remembered to plan. He built an entire identity out of being needed, and then he retired, and the calls stopped, not out of cruelty, simply because the machinery he had served no longer required servicing. And within 18 months, this composite man was, by his own private admission, unrecognizable to himself, not because he lost his job, but because he discovered, with a kind of vertigo, that underneath the fixer there had been almost no private person cultivated at all. The mask had been worn so continuously, so successfully, that it had quietly replaced the face. But notice, this arithmetic is not reserved for retirement. It shows up smaller and earlier than that. Imagine a woman in her 30s who has never once, not one single time, told a friend she did not have the energy to talk that night. She has built a reputation, warm, endlessly patient, the one you can call at midnight, and she is proud of that reputation, and she has no idea, none, that she has been quietly drawing down a private account for years without ever making a deposit. Then one ordinary Tuesday, nothing dramatic, just an ordinary exhausted Tuesday, she finds she cannot make herself pick up the phone, and she is bewildered by her own reaction. She calls it burnout. She calls it a bad week. She does not yet call it what Jung would have called it, the bill arriving. This is what he meant by consequence postponed rather than cancelled. The debt does not disappear simply because you refuse to look at the statement. It waits, and it tends to present itself precisely in the seasons when you are least equipped to pay it, at the funeral, where the strong one is expected to be strong, in the empty house after the children leave, in the silence after the retirement party ends and the calendar goes blank. This is the arithmetic Jung kept pointing to. Every hour spent performing availability for others is an hour not spent in relationship with your own interior. This is not an argument against generosity. Generosity that flows from a full well is one of the finer things a human being can offer. The trouble is a generosity that flows from an empty one, mistaken, for years, for virtue, because it looked so selfless from the outside, and felt, from the inside, like slowly disappearing. And the cruelest part of the arrangement is how invisible it is while it is happening. No one applauds you for the private hours you did not take. No one warns you that the account is thinning. The mask performs so well that even you are fooled by it. Right up until the afternoon, it is handed nothing left to perform with. The fourth key is a practice, and I want to offer it to you plainly. Take a page, and across the top, write nothing more dramatic than the masks I wear, and then simply list them: the employee, the parent, the friend who always answers texts within the hour, the host who cannot bear an empty chair at the table, the family peacekeeper, the one who is fine, always fine, no matter what week it has been. Do not judge the list as you make it. Jung was insistent that the persona is not something to be ashamed of, only something to be seen clearly. And seeing clearly requires you to first stop flinching from the list long enough to actually finish it. Most people abandon this exercise around the fourth or fifth mask, not because they run out of masks, but because something in them starts to feel exposed. That flinch is useful information. Mark it and keep writing. Once the list exists, go back through it slowly, and beside each mask, ask one honest question. Does this mask still fit the occasion, or has it become the only clothing I own? Notice which masks you can remove at the end of the day. Hang up and forget until morning. And notice which ones you have started sleeping in. This is the census. And it is uncomfortable precisely because it asks you to hold the mask at arm's length, long enough to see the shape of your own hand underneath it. Imagine a man doing this exercise on an ordinary Sunday evening. Nothing dramatic prompting it, just a quiet house and a pen. He writes down the reliable co-worker, the fun uncle, the calm one in family arguments, the guy who never cancels plans, and halfway down the page, he writes the one who is easy to be around. And he stops, because he cannot remember the last time he let himself be difficult in front of another human being. Not dramatic, not cruel, just difficult, tired, uncertain, unfinished. He realizes the mask labeled easy has not come off in years, not at dinner with his oldest friend, not even alone in his own kitchen, where, oddly, there was no one left to perform for, and yet the mask stayed on anyway, out of habit, out of a kind of muscle memory the body forms when a role has been played long enough. This is precisely what Jung meant when he warned that identification with the persona can produce, in his words, an artificial personality without punishment. At least for a while, the punishment here was subtle, not collapse, just a slow forgetting of what his own actual temperament even was. Some people doing this inventory discover that the mask labeled the strong one has not come off in 11 years. Not once, not during illness, not during grief, not during the ordinary exhaustion of a hard month. Some discover that the mask labeled patient parent has become so fused to their face that irritation itself now feels like a moral failure rather than a simple human weather system passing through. This is not an exercise in self-criticism. It is an exercise in inventory, plain and unglamorous. The way you might finally open a drawer you have been avoiding and lay out everything inside it on the table. You cannot renegotiate a contract you have never actually read, and most of us signed the contract of universal availability so early and so quietly, as children learning what earned love and what did not, that we mistook the terms of that contract for our personality rather than our performance. The mask, remember, was never chosen once and settled. It was built one small accommodation at a time, one swallowed complaint, one cancelled plan we said yes to anyway, one moment we smiled when we did not feel like smiling, until the accumulation became a structure so familiar it stopped feeling like structure at all. One caution, worth holding gently, and worth returning to each time this list starts to feel like an indictment. The goal here is not to storm through your life refusing every role. Roles are the scaffolding of shared existence. The parent still parents. The employee still shows up to the meeting. The friend still answers some of the texts. The goal is simply to know, in each moment you wear one, that you are wearing it, and that there is someone underneath doing the wearing. That quiet, private knowledge held even for a few seconds at a time is the entire hinge on which this key turns. Not less performance, but performance finally witnessed by the one performing it. The fifth key is the harder turn, the actual meaning of stopping being available to everyone. And I want to be careful here, because this phrase gets misused constantly to mean coldness, or withdrawal, or a kind of curated selfishness dressed up in the language of boundaries. That is not what Jung was describing, and it is not what I am describing either. What Jung pointed to instead was a redirection of psychic energy. He understood the psyche the way a physicist understands a closed system. Energy does not vanish, it moves. If all of your energy is spent maintaining the persona's availability to everyone who asks, there is, by simple arithmetic, none left over for the slower, quieter work of individuation, the work of becoming who you actually are, underneath the arrangement you made with the world. So stopping being available to everyone does not mean answering fewer calls out of spite. It means recognizing that every yes given automatically, out of identification rather than choice, is a small withdrawal from an account that was never bottomless. Think for a moment of how ordinary this looks from the outside. It rarely looks like a crisis. It looks like a phone that is never silenced, a calendar with no true blank squares, a person everyone describes, admiringly, as someone who always makes time. And admiration is exactly what makes the pattern so hard to interrupt. Because who wants to question a compliment? Imagine a woman who has said yes to every request for 11 straight years, not from a place of love each time, but from a place of not knowing there was another option. The co-worker who always needs her to cover, the friend who calls only when in crisis and vanishes the rest of the year, the extended family who assumes her calendar is public property simply because she has never once told them otherwise. None of these people are villains. They are simply operating on the reasonable assumption that the mask she offers them, endlessly cheerful, endlessly free, endlessly reachable, is the whole truth of her. And why would they assume otherwise? She has never shown them anything else. When she finally begins to say, quietly, and without a speech attached to it, "I am not available this time," something remarkable happens. Not around her. At first, the world does not applaud. Some of it is even mildly offended. A few relationships reveal, almost instantly, that they were built entirely on her usefulness, rather than her presence. That sting is real, and Jung would not have asked her to pretend it wasn't. But the remarkable thing happens inside her, not outside. She discovers, often with real surprise, that there was a person behind the yes the whole time, waiting patiently, the way a room waits behind a door nobody has opened in years. And the discovery is not comfortable. It rarely is. Jung never promised comfort here. He promised something closer to truth. He wrote that we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning, and the program most of us absorbed in the morning of our lives was simple: be needed, be liked, be available, answer, always answer. And it served its purpose then. It built the scaffolding. It kept you safe inside a family, a school, a community that rewarded compliance and quietly punished refusal. But a program written for the morning, followed unedited into the afternoon, becomes a kind of lie, not a moral failure, a mistiming. The same yes that once protected a child now slowly empties an adult. And here is a second angle on the same truth, worth sitting with. Notice that the ones who ask the most of your automatic availability are rarely the ones who ask what it costs you. This is not cruelty on their part. It is simply how identification works from both sides. They have only ever met the mask, so they only ever address the mask. And the mask, being a mask, cannot tell them it is tired. Only the person underneath can do that. And the person underneath has often been silent for so long that even she has forgotten the sound of her own refusal. This is the tension you are actually being asked to hold. Not persona against no persona, but persona as servant against persona as master. And holding that tension, sitting inside the discomfort of it, without immediately resolving it, by either total withdrawal or total surrender, without swinging from endless yes to a hardened, punishing no, is very close to what Jung meant by doing the real work of becoming a person. The energy that used to leak out in 100 automatic yeses does not disappear when you begin to withhold it. It collects, slowly, into something that finally has enough mass to build a self with. The sixth key is the corrective, and I want to leave you with it carefully, because it is easy to walk away with exactly the wrong lesson. The wrong lesson is that the mask is the villain, that persona equals fraud, that maturity means abolishing the social self and living in some raw, unmediated authenticity. Jung never taught this. He was explicit that persona belongs to a different category than shadow entirely. Shadow is what the ego refuses to look at. Persona is simply the tool the ego uses to move through a shared world. Having a persona is not a moral failing. Mistaking it for your entire identity is. And that difference is the whole hinge tonight's teaching turns on. Let me make this concrete. Imagine a manager who all week is the calm, decisive, endlessly reachable presence his team depends on. He answers messages at 10 at night, smooths conflicts he did not start, and is excellent at his role. Now imagine he hears a teaching like this one and takes the wrong conclusion from it. He decides the mask itself is the problem, so he stops answering anything, becomes abrupt with people who relied on his steadiness, and calls this individuation. Within a month his team is anxious, his relationships are strained, and privately he feels worse, not better. Because he has not met himself, he has simply swapped one performance, endless availability, for another, performed coldness. This is not what Jung meant. The instinct to overcorrect feels like freedom for a moment, when really it is the same unconsciousness wearing a different coat. Now imagine the same man doing something quieter. He keeps answering some messages and stops answering others, not by rule, but by asking each time whether this yes comes from care or from fear. Some nights he stays late for someone who genuinely needs him and is glad to pay that cost. Other nights he closes the laptop because he notices the pull to answer is only the old habit of needing to be needed. The mask is the same mask, manager, reliable, calm, but now there is someone standing behind it rather than dissolved into it. The tool remains, useful as ever, but finally there is someone holding it rather than being held by it. So the goal of individuation was never a self with no mask at all. That would not be maturity. That would be a person unable to function among others. The goal was a self who wears the mask consciously, reliable at work on Tuesday afternoon, tired and entirely unremarkable at home Tuesday night, without confusion about which one is more real, because both are real, each in its place. The trouble was never having a persona. The trouble was forgetting there was anyone home behind it, so that when the role finally goes quiet, retirement, an empty evening, a cancelled meeting, there is nothing but static where a person used to be. And here is where tonight's title earns its full weight. When you stop being available to everyone, you are not becoming less generous, you are becoming honest about where your generosity has actually been coming from. Some relationships built entirely on your automatic availability will feel the loss. The coworker used to a 10 o'clock reply. The relative who assumed your calendar was public property. That discomfort is data about the relationship, not a verdict against you. Other relationships, the ones never really about your usefulness, will remain, and often deepen. because they were never dependent on the mask to begin with. They were dependent on you. And inside your own private hours, something changes too, quietly. The part of you that reads slowly, that dreams strangely, that wants things nobody assigned you to want, begins, cautiously, to come back to the table. It does not arrive all at once. It arrives the way a person returns to a house they were exiled from for years, testing whether the door is really open or whether it will shut again the moment someone calls your name. This is not a program completed once. It is a relationship tended for as long as you live. The mask stays, useful as ever, but it stops being the whole address. There is, at last, someone living behind the door as well as in front of it, and that, quietly, changes everything that follows. Here is the whole picture. The mask was never your enemy. It became one only when you forgot you were wearing it. The professor who becomes the textbook, the fixer who cannot survive his own retirement, the woman who discovers a person behind 11 years of automatic yes, all of them are describing the same quiet drift, identification mistaken for identity, and the cure Jung offered was never withdrawal from the world, it was a return to conscious relationship with the roles you already play, worn deliberately instead of worn unconsciously, chosen instead of assumed, and when that shift happens, even slightly, everything around you does not necessarily change, but everything in you does, because for the first time in a long while, someone is actually home to notice. I notice where I have made myself available to everyone but myself. I am willing to see the mask I have mistaken for my face. I make the unconscious conscious. And so the question I will leave burning quietly by this fire tonight is simple. If you were not available to anyone for just 1 hour, no title, no role, no one calling your name, who exactly would be left in the room